basically have two questions. First is, what is long-term athlete, or what is long-term athletic development? That's the first question. So I'll have the panelists answer that one. And then after that, we'll go on to, if you are in the situation, such as the person who inquired was about, I have to go to a school board meeting or a coaches meeting, or my athletic director wants me to present to all the coaches. What things do I take to that presentation? How do I go about my presentation and trying to get my school, club, organization, community to see the value of long-term athletic development and to buy into it? So again, starting with the first question, I don't care which panelist starts, but in your eyes, in your view, what is long-term athlete development?
Gosh, I'll jump in since nobody else is starting. It's Rick Howard. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you this morning. Happy that you're on board. As Joe mentioned, I do have a little bit of background with the National Strength and Conditioning Association in terms of actually putting together a long-term athletic development position statement, which has 10 pillars associated with it. We came up with a definition within that position statement, which read that it refers to the chronic development of athleticism over time to enhance health and performance, reduce injury risk, and enhance the confidence and competence of all youth. So I think since we started this conversation several years ago, we've kind of adjusted this. A lot of these models were originally started to stop a lot of that peak by Friday mentality, that we really needed a much better long-term approach. And we knew a lot of the things that did not work, but we weren't really sure what did work. So we needed to try some things. So we looked at a couple different models, and we figured out that the athleticism piece is something that is really huge, but it's also our biggest enemy. So when we look at long-term athletic development, we have this one big camp where everybody is really looking for the sports performance, but we have this other big camp where we're saying, well, how are we working on the health and longevity of all of the population? So we've kind of shifted our definition a little bit, looking at it more as a cradle to grave approach. And I'm so excited at this unfortunate period of time. I'm seeing more material about how families are actually interacting together, doing things together, moving together. You know, it's more than just dropping your kids off somewhere and even following the sports model in that degree. So from my perspective, personally, I'm really excited right now that we're starting to look at and I know a lot of people get rolled the eyes when I start talking about the wellness wheel, but I really think that that is really important when we're moving forward with where we're going here. It's not just the physical. The physical is really important, of course, but so is the spiritual, the financial, the mental, our academic, our social and psychological, as well as the technical and tactical perspectives of this, and the strength and conditioning. So it's all of these elements together. And what's happened over the past few years is it's evolved into this great model. And it really is just that. It's a model, it's a framework where we're trying to lead toward physical literacy, which is another open-ended question for another day. But we'll get there too. I did also want to mention, though, when we mentioned that it's the chronic development of athleticism within our long-term athletic development model, we went back and forth for, gosh, the length of the paper, I think, what word could we come up with? But we stuck with LTAD because at least at that point, it was a word, it was a phrase that was starting to get recognized. So we thought, well, if we go with the recognized language, maybe we can influence people that way. That'll get into the second part of the question, but I wanted to mention the definition we came up with for athleticism, because in the US, I think we look only at peak athleticism as being athleticism. If you're not a superstar, you're really not athletic. So we're only looking at, you're either at that elite level or you're just somebody else. But athleticism is the ability to repeatedly perform a range of movement skills with style, precision, and confidence in a variety of environments, which requires competent levels of strength, power, speed, agility, balance, coordination, and energy. So in the US, we kind of have this issue going on right now where we're only looking at health-related fitness variables of cardiovascular endurance, muscle strength, muscle endurance, flexibility, and body composition. And then the sports skills, the things that kids like to do, we kind of ignore that. And say, well, that's not really important. And that's kind of changed our framework and how we actually look at physical activity. And during this time where I think we should really be looking at the amount of structured versus semi-structured versus non-structured play and activities, a lot of what I'm seeing going out to families is trying to get them to maintain a very structured environment. And I think this is a perfect environment to blend all three of those together within the family and giving kids that time to actually grow and mold it as they need. I know I talked a long time, so I'll turn it over to somebody else to add a little bit here.
I'll jump in, Peter here. I look at this through maybe a little bit of a different lens because I currently teach physical education for kindergarten through fourth grade. And the way that I define long-term athletic development is that it's an underlying philosophy or approach or model to just meet kids where they're at, meet people where they're at, and provide them what they need to continue pursuing, whether that's competitive sport, physical activity, whatever activities that they want to. So it's really just about good coaching and meeting them where they're at, both physically, cognitively, socially, emotionally, and providing them what they need. I'm more excited about the second question because I think where the rubber meets the road is what that looks like in implementation. Get in there, James.
I'll jump in. Okay. I agree with the definitions that Rick and Peter have just sort of mentioned. I think it does depend on the environment that you're in. I think Peter's in a unique situation. I find myself in a national centre of excellence in Aspire, but also having worked in a UK secondary school, but also having worked in the private sector within the UK as well. So where we've been trying to recruit kids into programs to help them improve their sports performance. So three very different environments. But in all of them, I think, to me, building on the definition of that Rick mentioned it and stealing from Calvin Giles, it's about a progressive curriculum, and it's up to the coach to design that to suit the environment that they find themselves in and the kids that they have in front of them, but a progressive curriculum that transports them from a developing athlete or person into someone who is physically much more advanced. And it's about how we select and sequence and progress different sports, activities, physical development structures, programs to help them move along that pathway. And as Peter said, it's about meeting them where they're at, but helping to scaffold and transport them through that process to the point where they're at their, achieving their potential, I guess, whatever that may be, whether that's, an active lifestyle, an elite performer, or, a high level college performer or university, if you're in the UK. I think it's about helping everyone achieve their potential with that progressive system.
James, you mentioned curriculum. How do you define curriculum?
How would I define curriculum? I'd say it's the overarching framework that guides the pathway of what we do. There's within that, then there's different modules which target different aspects or cover different areas of physical development, and then have aspects of that curriculum that are not physical in nature. So you have the psychological and lifestyle factors built into that as well. So yeah, I'd say for me, the curriculum is the framework and the guide, the objectives, the outcomes that we're working towards. And then the individual modules of work, if you like, make up that curriculum. I mean, what would your definition be, Peter? Do you have something different?
Oh, no, it's just interesting. So, I host a podcast with a couple of friends called The Other Literacies, and this season is all about curriculum. And I think often people get confused with the difference between instructional materials, like a lesson plan that's, progressed and everything, and they call that a curriculum. But a curriculum, like you're kind of mentioning, is this bigger umbrella. It's your mission, your vision, your values. It's your pedagogical approach. It's how you're scaffolding stuff and differentiating stuff. So I like what you're saying, because I think a lot of times people mix that up with instructional materials. They pull a textbook off a shelf and they call that a curriculum, which isn't right.
I think of it as and I think it has to be when you're dealing with adolescents, because the different stages that all of them can be at different times. I think having a flexible, objective-based system within that curriculum that people can achieve those objectives and move through at their own sort of rate of development, reflecting their, you know, their maturation status, their training age, and those kind of things. I think there's a good paper, if people haven't seen it, by Ian Jeffries, The Quadrennial Plan for the High School Athlete. Maybe Joe can dig that out now. I see he's checking some papers in the chat window, but that sets out a really nice 4-phase system that has those objectives that you can work towards. It's then really a case of building out the content to achieve those objectives based on your own, I guess, skill set and environment that you find around you. But that's a really nice paper that really helped me in the early days sort of build off that into the environment that I was in within the UK school. But yeah, some useful resources, I think.
Yeah, let's move on. Let's let Jeremy Frisch jump in here as the last panelist, and then I think we can open it up. There's a few questions coming in, and we can open it up a little bit to some Q&A. And I see the other people who are on the call, and I think we can provide some other great insight into this this question as well. So yeah, let's let Jeremy respond here.
Can you guys hear me now?
A little bit louder, Jeremy.
Hold on. Can you hear me now?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So anyways, no, I agree with everything you guys are saying. You know, for me, long-term athletic development is pretty much, you know, trying to figure out, because I have, you know, in my work, I have athletes coming from all different age ranges, from, you know, 5 years old, you know, children, all the way up through high school and college. And so for me, long-term athletic development is trying to meet them where they're at and give them the appropriate tools that they need to sort of become a better athlete and do better in their sport, depending on what age they're at, you know what I mean? So I think there's certain things you do with pre-adolescents compared to adolescents, compared to, you know, high school and college kids. And then intertwined in that is that kids have their own specific sports to play. They have their own, you know, body structure, things like that, emotional needs, psychological needs. So I think all of those things kind of come into play. And for me, long-term athletic development comes down to what does each individual athlete need, or each individual person? And I think that's the trick. And that's the thing I've been trying to figure out and study and learn about for the past few years. And I think I'll probably continue to try to learn those things. You know what I mean? It's a never-ending process, but you know, I just always trying to figure out at which age, you know, what do we do with this athlete at this age? What's the best thing for that athlete? And that's sort of what I do every single day, you know, at my facility.
Yeah, great. So let's open it up to people who are on the call here. If you think there's anything that's missing from what the panelists provided, I think they covered a lot of ground. But if you see this differently, feel free to jump in here, unmute yourself, and have the floor. Anybody? Des Ryan, Mike Jennings, Leo Totten, want to jump in, provide the extra insight, or if there's any, you know, any questions that you want to get at, you know, to deepen the conversation in terms of information that the panelists provided, feel free, you know, to jump on or put it in the chat box here. I'm going to try to keep this at about probably about 5 or 7 more minutes, and then move on to the second question, just in lieu of time.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. I was just typing up a response to one of the questions in the chat box. The one thing that kind of stands out to me when all of the panelists talk is kind of the idea of meeting people where they're at. I think that's something that is oftentimes missed in any approach that you're taking. So kudos to all the panelists for talking about that. I think that's very important. And I also want to kind of piggyback off of what Jeremy was saying. I don't know if anybody noticed but everybody, regardless of age group that Jeremy works with, he just refers to as athletes. And I think that's really important, especially with regard to long-term athletic or long-term athlete development, because especially in the physical education world, we get people all the time saying, well, that kid's not an athlete. He doesn't play any sports, or he's not an athlete. Well, I think that's a bad take, right? I think everybody's an athlete, and I think we're just trying to work through different movement problems. And I think Rick and the NSCA's definition of athlete is spot on. And I think that type of thing needs to be sold to families and students and young people and adults alike. So I think that's pretty important stuff.
Thanks for sharing, Mike. Anybody else want to jump in, add anything, or ask specific questions related to any of the panelists or all of them?
Hello.
We got you. You're good.
Yeah. Hi guys. Just asked Jeremy there. Just he was saying you need to work with individual athletes and what that individual athlete needs. What I was just wondering is how would you practically approach that if you were in a group environment? Like most guys are working with groups of youth athletes. How would you target a specific athlete?
Well, you know what? I think for the most part, very young athletes are they all need to develop the same skills. You know what I mean? So when I'm working with younger athletes, in the pre-athletic, I think kids across the board are need the same things. They need to work on the same skills, fundamental movement skills, foundational skills, coordination, balance, like all those things. I think when you get older, when the athlete starts to grow, when you start to hit growth spurts, things like that, I think that's when you sort of need to really sort of individualize. So that's when I start to individualize. Primarily, I think it comes down to the strength training part, because that's probably the most dangerous part. So you want to make sure your athletes can do the exercises correctly. And since everyone's growing at different rates and everyone's body's different, they'll need different exercises and different approaches to how to do things. You know what I mean? So that's really where I start to individualize training. Most athletes all sprint. I think most athletes, as they get older, they need to start some type of plyometric program, jumping program, things like that. Those things for me are pretty broad across. I think all my kids do that stuff. Like I said, it gets individualized when they get older. And I start to introduce them to things like Olympic lifts. Like we got some kids that can come in and learn Olympic lifts in a day. Other kids, it's going to take a long time. Some kids, I might just scrap that idea and we may focus on just kettlebell work or body weight work. So I think that's when when you're dealing with a potential, you want to teach an athlete how to do something the right way, and you got to figure out what it is that they can. What tools are you going to use to make them successful? I guess. I hope that answers your question.
I wouldn't mind jumping in here because I also work with pretty large groups. I have 32 kids coming in usually. So 32 5-year-olds come into me at once. So it's an interesting challenge to tackle. And I think the way I individualize it, and it's not individualizing it, it's really just providing the students some choice, is having a range of options. So trying to think of like a really simple example. Let's just take basketball dribbling, which isn't the best skill example, but it's easy to share this. I might have regular basketballs out. I might have volleyballs out, which are a little bit more pumped up. They're easier to dribble. They don't have to hit them as hard in order for them to bounce. And then I might have a range of other options of balls. So equipment scaling using the constraint-led approach, but providing the students the choice to choose how they go about that, because I think that also allows them to decide how much success or failure they want to have within that skill. So that's how I do it. from kindergarten all the way up to 4th grade. And usually I'll label them as like easy, medium, or easiest, a little bit more difficult, most difficult when it comes to a different skill.
I'll piggyback off that a little bit if I could. Oh, go ahead, James.
No. Crack on, Rick. I'll jump in after.
I was just thinking back to what Peter said, because when I taught physical education, basketball ruled. It was actually the social strata of the student body, how well they played, that determined how many friends they had. So it was huge. So one of the things that I agree with everything you said and what Jeremy has said too, I would also add, ask the kids. It's one of the important things that sometimes we forget to do. Kids know what they like. Kids know what they need sometimes. So helping them guide us through the process, and then we guide them through the process, I think is huge too. So I do a lot of the same thing with constraints led and having different stations or areas that they can gravitate to. And that helps me as a coach to actually figure out what they do well and what they don't do so well, what they might need a little bit more work with. So then I can rearrange what they do based on that. But giving kids a voice in what they do really helps to keep them coming back. Go ahead, James, sorry.
Sure, no worries. A good point. So I think it's, when I think about the question around how do we deal with these differences in the group, but like you, Rick, I jump back to my PE teacher training and the hammerings I took on my observations when people were assessing my lessons and things about how I'd set up the lesson. And I think it's about having, when you've got large groups within groups, and whether if that's a technical tactical session, or you're teaching the sport through basketball, football, rugby, whatever it may be, then that might be their skill level dictates which group they fall into, and then you adjust the task for each group to make sure that the challenge point for that group is in the right place. If it's too hard, especially when you're dealing with kids that, if we're looking at a physical education class, and you're going to have kids in that group which are engaged in sport and love sport, but at the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have kids that don't love sport and aren't engaged in the activity, and they're there because they have to be there. So I think when you're dealing with the kids at the bottom end, it's about setting your task at a level that allows them to have a lot of success. So that could be as simple as, it might be 4 people versus one defender. In another group, it's 2v2, and it's a much harder game. So it can be differentiation based on the skill level if we're talking about technical sports. But if we're talking about strength and conditioning, I think, like Jeremy said, I view it in the younger years as there's a finite list of skills that we need to develop, training skills in terms of the fundamental movement skills, speed and agility. There's only so many effective ways for changing direction, the jumping, leaping, hopping tasks. It's then about looking again for maybe those groups within groups and putting the athletes that you've got into different buckets and then training those guys together. Now, the theme of the program for me when I work with a larger group of athletes, let's talk about strength training, it's probably going to be, the program's going to be squat, push, lunge, pull, brace, rotate, maybe as a simple 6 exercise program if I've got maybe 30 to 45 minutes with a group. But if we take some of my groups that I work with at Aspire, when we get them at grade 8, we can see differences in maturation of up to 6 years in terms of their bone age. So we've got kids that are very much pre-peak height velocity and kids that are very far post-peak height velocity. So that program, or the general patterns that we're using, just become the central piece. Everyone's squatting, and they all squat at the same time, so we can coach them. We'll set them up to be peer coaching as well, so they can learn about the movement, learn to what that movement should look like to help them learn. But what that squat is for one and what it is for the other could be 2 different things. Someone could be doing a bodyweight squat or a counterbalance squat, whereas someone else is learning a front squat with a 5 kilo training bar. Someone else who's much more mature might be onto a back squat, but they'll all be doing the same movement pattern. And I tend to do that when I'm working with larger groups because I've only got one movement to observe. And if I've got kids, let's say simple math, say we've got a group of 18 kids, maybe we have 9 pairs working, but if I get them working in the pairs, 1 coaching, 1 working, I've then reduced my ratio down to 1 to 9. I can see how they're doing those things. I can make sure that the quality's high enough. And then as we move through the program, the next exercise we go to, if it's a pushing movement, maybe some of them are on an incline push-up, some of them are on a push-up on the floor, some of them have got their feet elevated, others are doing dumbbell presses. So when you've got those large ranges, it's just about identifying then who should work with who, what are the appropriate exercises for them, whether it's based on their training age, their biological age, both of those things, and then just working the program as best as you can, depending on the number of athletes you've got, and just getting people to a point where they're challenged, but it's not so hard that they want to then pull away from it, or that, you know, that you're prescribing an inappropriate intensity of an exercise for an individual in any part of the group.
Yeah, great. So thanks to all the panelists for those responses and for the questions that came in afterwards on question 1. Again, we recorded this so we can go back. And I think the other thing I want to do is go back and filter through it and kind of take out some of the key concepts as well, and have those available to individuals. But let's move on to question 2, which becomes a lot more practical, because there are individuals who are in this situation. There's probably a lot of us on this call who have been in this situation as well, where we are the expert in long-term athletic development in the community or the school, and we've been asked to give a presentation to a school board, to the coaching staff, or to a community. But again, we have other individuals who, you know, they're just getting into this space and they need some guidance. The first part of the guidance was, you know, what is long-term athletic development, which was just discussed. But if you are going into that room this evening and you need to give a presentation, what's in your slide deck? How do you go about the presentation? How do you go about selling this idea, this concept, and getting buy-in from the stakeholders who are sitting in that room?
I'll jump in and go first here. I'm excited about this question because I think operationalizing long-term athletic development is not easy, and it's really where the rubber meets the road. So I honestly, and I actually went through that this past year, coming to a new school. It's a second-year school, has no physical education program as of year 1. So I'm starting this program from scratch. So through the interview process, I had to sell our principals on what it is that I wanted to do. And honestly, I don't think our principals could even tell you what long-term athletic development is. If you said, hey, define long-term athletic development, they'd be like, what are you talking about? But what they could define is what our vision of our movement program is, what our mission for this year of our movement program is, and then what are the values of that program. And then what you would see as experts and practitioners in long-term athletic development is that those align to the long-term athletic development model. So just to give my example, I'm going to screen share here. This was actually something that I sent home to parents, was an update from the first trimester. And it clearly states our vision and our mission. And our vision, and we can debate that definition of physically literate probably for a while as well, but to develop physically literate students. And then my year 1 mission of developing this program is to foster a joy for movement that leads to a pursuit of activity. And that the key word there is joy, and that everything this first year is through that lens of joy. Like, is what I'm doing right now going to bring more or less joy to these students as they pursue movement in my class? And then underneath vision and mission is my values, and aligning those values to our vision and mission. And my values are equity. So making sure that every single student has an equitable opportunity to pursue this joy of movement. That's also a school value of our school. My second value is relationships and student voice, making sure that students have a say in everything, that they're asked for their opinion, and that relationships are sacred. That's year number 1. Probably the most important thing is building those relationships with students. My second value is that play is a form of teaching, and that play can be used to develop skill through the constraints-led approach. So thinking of play as a continuum from more structured to less structured, and using that as a form of teaching. So watching kids play, using that to inform the content of what we're doing within movement, manipulating that strategically, having some elements of risky play. It's something that I know if you were to ask our community what we value, that would be one thing that comes up, is risky play. And then my fourth value and my last value is this idea of multi-activity sampling. If you follow me on Twitter, you'd see that our most recent activity sampling is skateboarding. And I can't even explain how much of a success that has been. Hopefully third grade will still get to do their swimming after all of this stuff dies down, but that's another activity that's getting sampled. K1 is doing jujitsu. The whole school did some golf with First Tee, which is a great organization. Trying to think of some of the other activities we've sampled, but trimestrally we're doing some activity sampling. But when I'm explaining it to a stakeholder, I'm saying, here is what I want to accomplish. Here is what I'm going to do this year to help accomplish that vision. And then here are the values that I'm going to align everything that I do. And then as I'm sharing information, I'm connecting it to those values.
Well, it's a tough act to follow, Peter. That's great stuff, actually. I appreciate that. I look at it from a two-pronged approach when asked this question. The first one is, just like we mentioned in the first conversation, meeting people where they are. Why are we invited? What is it they really want to get at? Because the second part of this question is getting to why. So I think when we look at a long-term athletic development approach, too often we really want to make that quick fix and completely change the whole screen of youth sports and youth physical activity. Peter, you're doing a great job because you're breaking it down into components that people can see and they know that it's actually working, rather than saying, all right, we're going to completely redesign how youth sports are organized and here's what we can do. So sometimes that's not an easy fix. So figuring out, if we get invited, why? What are the problems that they actually would like to have solved, so that we can show them the exact things that we can do using the LTAD framework to help them to reach some small goals to build it on, so that eventually we get to where we want it to be. But I think too often we forget that it really is a long-term approach. So cutting off a little piece at a time, even if it's having a little piece of practice to do a little bit of skills and to work on some of the things that James was talking about and some of the things that Jeremy does, I think would be fantastic.
I jump in here. Is anyone else good? I think definitely having, like Peter has, a structure and a framework for people to see what they're buying into is a really important part. I think, I went through a process in the UK of years trying to convince PE teachers and schools to take on youth strength and conditioning as part of their PE programs. And I used to sit in an office working with a guy called Ed Archer, who's definitely someone we should try and get on one of these chats. And I phoned about 60 schools, trying to get them in, trying to convince them that, we could help them, help their athletes, but we were banging our heads against a brick wall for a long time. And actually what I found that got the buy-in in the end was actually just going in and getting started and taking some action, running free sessions for them, particularly if you're an outsider. Like Peter starting his program, he's been employed by the school, there's people bought into that process. But I think when you're outside of that organization, and particularly if you're not a PE teacher, you can be looked at as the outsider who maybe doesn't understand what it takes to do that within a school setting. And I found until I was inside, and I was running external programs, and I moved into the PE setting and did a PE teacher training course, and that was actually where we set up the pathway within the school in the UK. And even when we started, people didn't really understand what we were doing. So there was an education process, a lot of what Peter did, but it was really when they started to see the results for the kids and how they were progressing that really got the buy-in. And it certainly wasn't a perfect system when we began. We started with 5 lessons across a fortnight, and we just got some good work done. And it was after that the program started to grow and we gradually got given more time. So I think taking action is a big part of it. Being prepared to educate and have a framework and a structure. I remember sitting down with the senior leadership team at the school after the first year, and I was asking them to give me more time with the grade 7, 8, and 9, as we were only running an after-school program. And I think they basically sat in the room. I shared the framework very much like you had there, Peter, and they were then convinced because there was a plan. They basically said, "Oh, we thought you were just messing around in the gym with them for 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon." It was like, no, there's like a real structure and a framework built off the good work of Ian Jeffries, Calvin Giles, those guys to guide it. So having a plan, being prepared to just take action, they're big things to get started. But I think also one of the things that became apparent with those conversations with the senior leadership team is you're dealing with different stakeholders within a school. And every school is slightly different. And I've worked with many of them over the years. And what you have to get down to is what are we helping them to do? And what is the benefit to them as a school? And each person with it, each stakeholder within that organization, the athlete and the parents, they're in it for something. The head of department or the head of PE, maybe he wants successful sports teams. The senior leadership team are interested in the progress of the pupils, but also that the school's attractive for people to want to come to it. So I think when we sit down in these meetings, it's about understanding all of those stakeholders and what the pathway offers them. Now, for us, what we saw and what really got the buy-in to the program was people started to really buy into the program. And then the senior leadership team saw that more people were coming to the school because of this program, when they could have chosen better schools in the area from an academic perspective. So I think it's, as I say, it's having a plan, taking action, but understanding the benefits and what's in it for each of those individuals within an organization or layers of people. I think if you can get to that, then you've got a good chance of getting buy-in with your program.
James, I know your curriculum quite well, and the past question Peter asked you about that word curriculum, and so like speed, agility, strength, power, I know that you have a very well laid out curriculum. Would you have a slide, a handout that you would walk these stakeholders through and explain to them, what that progression is, why you're doing that progression?
So the framework was laid out into the foundation, development, and performance phases. Foundation was 2 years, development 2 years, performance 2 to 3 years, depending on rates of progression. So they would see that framework, they'd see the objectives, and we'd explain at the start of each year to parents what we were working towards that year, what to expect, things that were likely to happen. So we know in grade 7, girls were likely to go through PHV. In grade 8 and grade 9, we'd see more boys go through. We'd help them understand that process and what was happening for later developers, early developers, trying to help the early developers not get too carried away, the late developers just to hang in there and, this is what's happening. So big education process, but laying out all of those things and what we were going to do, particularly in the early days when people just had no idea what it was. When we're talking about 2013, schools, certainly state schools, weren't developed from a strength and conditioning perspective. And so we really had to lay it out for people to understand what they were buying into. For us at our school, they were choosing to do that over an academic subject. So we really needed to show them that what they were buying into was valuable and was going to help them.
Great. All right, let's move on to Jeremy Frisch. So Jeremy, if you're in Clinton, Massachusetts, and you have to go into the school or a local club, what's your strategy?
So I can tell you, I've already done this. So I had a meeting with the superintendent, the elementary school principal, as well as the school committee. My approach was a little bit different from the long-term athletic development. I approached it from a learning perspective. So I think that I know a lot of, I'm good friends with the people who work for the school. We're in such a small town. And so I can tell you that a lot of administrators are under a tremendous amount of pressure for their schools to do well, when it comes to standardized testing and things like that. So my approach was to explain to them that, we really kids need movement in order to do better in school, which also made those skills that they need, they develop through movement, are also the foundations of athletic skills, right? But so, I tried to explain to them that being able to read and look up at the board and listen and sit for long periods of time requires a tremendous amount of balance and strength and coordination. If kids want to be successful in class, they need to have this sort of physical framework in place prior to learning. And most of the school committee or the principal and the superintendent never heard of such a thing. They had no idea, because I think years ago most children when they entered elementary school, they had a decent foundation because they spent a lot of time outside playing. But that's not the case anymore. And you can actually take most of the kids that I've had in my facility that are labeled ADD or ADHD, they usually present with poor balance. They have poor movement skills. They can't sit for long periods of time. They have poor posture, things like that. So it just kind of shows you that, physically kids need more skills to be able to learn. So for me, that was my approach, because I'm always looking at where do we start? Like, what's the foundation? And that's why I was in meeting with the elementary school teachers, because that's kind of what my first step was. I wanted to explain to them that, children need physical skills in order to be able to learn. And then from there, as they get older, obviously those skills can turn into sports skills, more sports specific skills, things like that. And so I've had this meeting, and for me, that's where it really, I thought that they should know and they should learn that children need those physical skills in place. And we've actually already started this past year, starting with the kindergarten, we've implemented a program where, those kids get extra movement every day with the idea that it will help them, with their academics. You guys hear me?
Yeah, great. Yeah, I got better there towards the end. Thanks.
Yeah, Jeremy, I stopped your video so that we could hear you a little bit better. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay. So can you repeat any of that?
Peter's the movement engineer and the audio engineer here on the LTAD chat. So yeah, good. So good information there from the four panelists in terms of, holding an information and or implementation meeting with key stakeholders. So here in the last, 8-10 minutes or whatever, open it up for questions related to that second question.
Can I come in on this one? Can you hear me?
Yep.
I can't. I don't know whether my video's on at the minute or everybody can see. Really interesting, by the way, list to all this. So I'm out in Dubai, a previous head of PE of a school, and now working a lot with the IPLA, the International Physical Literacy Association, and very much focused out in the UAE, where there is very much a focus on early specialisation in academies and elitism, and trying to pass the word on a physical literacy. There's a few things that I really touched on, which I thought was fantastic to hear. One, which was about the building of relationships and about the importance of that, where there is the physical and conditioning and the learning of physical skills, which, yes, has an amazing impact on not only children's thinking and learning and their behavior, but really it's not the what activity, it's the why and whether they value it. So when I am speaking to teachers and delivering and taking the program forward, I tend to, again, come from a slightly different approach and present some of the facts that stand in front, which is that children are dropping out of sport, in some cases 70% by the age of 12, because they don't enjoy it anymore, because they're burnt out from being focused in a particular area. And within that, also within PE lessons, where PE teachers, and from many colleagues I've worked with who Some are doing an amazing job and still do a fantastic job, but there are an awful lot who aren't, sadly. And when you see a lot of children are leaving school, no longer liking or valuing physical activity, where I almost sell it is that the requirement to ensure that there's a window of opportunity within a school day in order to ensure that children are enjoying movement, enjoying physical activity through structured and unstructured play and movement. So therefore, that instead of it needing always to have a set direction of this is exactly what it looks like, there is a more of a holistic view that they see, yes, the element that it's the physical element, but they also value the enjoyment that it doesn't necessarily always just have to look in a particular line of a sport. And I hope that sort of makes some sense.
Yeah, anybody else have further comment related to the, implementation meeting, how you'd go about it, successes, failures, lessons learned? Okay, we're rolling up to the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of people's time. People probably have another Zoom conference to get on, since this seems to be the thing people are doing these days. But this is something I think that we're going to continue. We're trying to discuss if we want to do it weekly or bi-weekly. Definitely willing to hear your input as well. At this point, I think I have 4 or 5 other people who are going to kind of get on and do some individual things. We are going to do more panel discussions moving forward. We have a range of topics, again, very similar to the Twitter chat as well. This has been recorded. It will be archived and shared with everybody. Again, want to thank everybody for getting on this morning. Thank the 4 panelists for providing some really great insight onto this topic. Again, kind of at a intro level as well, like what is it, and if we need to sell it to a group, how do we do that? Again, for several people on this call, you've already been through that process, but I think what's more important is this is going to help others as they move forward as well. So thanks for everybody, and stay tuned. We'll do this again, maybe next Saturday or the following Saturday, and have a good weekend.